Welcome to the Facilitators Deep Dive Podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery. Looks like we're diving into intercultural communication today. You've really outdone yourself with this stack of sources. We've got a textbook, some research papers on tourism and forgiveness across cultures, and even a bit about how the media shapes things.
Quite the mix. It's like we're building a toolkit for understanding how people connect across cultures, or even sometimes how they clash.
Yeah, and the textbook starts off by defining culture, and, it's more than just art and music, right?
Oh, absolutely. Think of it as a society's operating system.
So,
It's those shared beliefs and values that shape how people raise their kids, run their businesses, everything. It's funny how it's often invisible until you encounter a different system and you think, wait, that's not how I do things.
right, and the textbook even mentioned that the word culture comes from this Latin word that means cultivating, which actually makes a lot of sense. It's something we nurture and pass down.
Totally. And that cultivation happens on different levels. The textbook uses this model, where the core is a culture's history and identity. Then you have this middle layer where that core shows up in everyday life, rituals, customs, how they communicate.
Okay, so far so good.
And then on the outside, you've got the big stuff, economics, politics, education.
So even something as simple as what people wear can be a reflection of those deeper cultural layers.
Absolutely. Think about a t-shirt, a band logo, a political slogan, a traditional pattern. Each one tells a story about the wearer's connection to their culture.
And speaking of stories, the textbook goes on to talk about popular culture, things like telenovelas, those soap operas that are huge all over the world.
Ah, yes. Those can actually reveal a lot about a culture's values and beliefs. Researchers actually study them, to understand things like gender roles or family dynamics, even attitudes towards love and betrayal.
I never thought of soap operas as research material. That's interesting.
They're a goldmine. The textbook even uses the example of Latin American telenovelas. They're popular globally, and they offer a window into that culture's views on family and relationships.
Right, it shows how pop culture can spark conversations about universal themes, but also how different cultures interpret those themes. It's like a window into another world.
Exactly.
Now, one thing that's obviously changing the world is globalization. All the sources mention that.
Yeah, globalization has woven this incredible web connecting people, products, ideas across continents, but it's also created this tension between global forces and local cultures.
I think the textbook called that tension glocalization. They used the example of McDonald's in Russia, how they had to adapt their menu and marketing to local tastes.
It's a constant balancing act. Companies, even individuals, have to figure out how to navigate this globalized world while still respecting local traditions and identities.
It seems like understanding other cultures really starts with understanding how they see the world, which the textbook says can be very different from our own perception.
Oh, for sure. Our cultural background is like a filter on our perception. It shapes how we interpret everything around us.
The textbook mentioned three tendencies: closure, familiarity, and expectation, and how those can lead to misunderstandings.
Yeah, with closure, we fill in the gaps based on our own assumptions. Familiarity makes us cling to what we know, and expectation makes us see what we want to see. All of these, of course, are influenced by our cultural lens.
So something like personal space, how close you stand to someone, that can feel totally normal in one culture and completely off in another. The textbook used that example.
It's like an invisible dance, right?
Yeah.
Understanding those unspoken cultural rules is key to navigating communication successfully.
Then there's the whole issue of stereotypes and prejudice, which the textbook says can really damage communication.
Yeah, stereotypes are those oversimplified mental shortcuts we use to categorize people, often based on very limited information. And they can lead to prejudice, those negative attitudes that can create real barriers.
The textbook even points out how stereotypes can become like self-fulfilling prophecies.
Exactly. If someone is constantly treated based on a negative stereotype, it can affect their behavior and performance. Sadly, reinforcing that stereotype.
Like if someone believes the stereotype that people from a certain country are bad at languages, the textbook actually says that can make those individuals more anxious and less likely to succeed in language learning.
It really shows the power of our perceptions and how important it is to be aware of our own biases and actively challenge those harmful stereotypes.
So how do we start unpacking these cultural differences in a more constructive way? The textbook talks about the power of understanding a culture's values.
Values are like a compass guiding a culture's choices and behaviors. The textbook uses this framework called value orientations to explain how different cultures see fundamental things, like human nature, time, relationships.
And one big contrast they highlight is between individualistic and collectivistic cultures.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. In individualistic cultures, like in the US, the focus is on personal goals and independence. But in collectivistic cultures, like many in Asia, group harmony and interdependence are more important. This difference shapes everything, from communication styles to how they handle conflict.
So, like the textbook mentions, sharing personal problems might be a way to connect in individualistic cultures, but in collectivistic cultures, it could be seen as burdening others, disrupting that group harmony.
Exactly. Those differing values can lead to a lot of misunderstandings if you're not aware of them.
And of course, we can't forget about language itself. The sources really emphasize that it's much more than just words.
Oh, absolutely. Language is the operating system of our thoughts. It shapes our identity, how we relate to the world. It's the tool we use to understand and express ourselves, but it can also be a barrier between cultures.
The textbook mentions this mind-blowing idea called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that the language we speak can actually influence how we perceive reality.
It's a fascinating concept. Just think, if your language had, say, a dozen words for love, wouldn't you experience love in a more nuanced way than someone whose language only has one?
I see what you mean. It's like that classic example the textbook used, how Inuit languages have all these words for snow.
Exactly. It reflects a deeper understanding and experience of snow than cultures with, fewer words for it.
Shows how different languages lead to different ways of, like, categorizing and experiencing the world.
Exactly.
And it seems like becoming a better intercultural communicator involves paying attention to what's not being said, too, all those nonverbal cues.
Oh, absolutely. Body language, eye contact, even how we use space and scent. These can all send powerful messages that we're not always consciously aware of.
And the textbook points out how these nonverbal signals can vary drastically across cultures.
For example, a thumbs up can mean great job in one culture, but be a serious insult in another. So understanding those cultural nuances is key to avoiding misunderstandings.
The textbook had some great anecdotes about those kinds of misinterpretations, like how a hug, which seems like a universal gesture of friendliness, can be perceived very differently depending on the cultural context.
Absolutely. That's why it's so crucial to be mindful of our nonverbal communication, especially when interacting with people from different backgrounds.
Now, speaking of interacting with different cultures, the textbook goes into the challenges and rewards of adapting to a new culture, especially for immigrants.
Yeah, immigration often forces people to navigate multiple cultural worlds, the host culture, their home culture, even the blended culture their children might create.
It's a lot to juggle. The textbook outlines different acculturation strategies: assimilation, separation, integration, marginalization, each with its own implications for communication and identity.
Right. Those strategies describe different ways people try to balance their original culture with the new one. Some try to blend in completely, others maintain distance, and some try to bridge both worlds.
So how do those cultural differences play out on a larger scale? All the sources touch on the issue of conflict in our globalized world.
Well, conflict is an unfortunate reality whenever different groups interact, and globalization has, amplified those interactions. Whether it's historical grievances, economic disparities, or clashes over values, those underlying tensions can sometimes erupt.
The textbook uses the example of the Cronulla riots in Australia, where racial and cultural tensions escalated into violence. A sobering reminder of how quickly things can unravel.
Absolutely. It really underscores the importance of understanding those cultural fault lines and developing effective strategies for managing those differences.
Speaking of shaping perceptions, the sources all point to the powerful role of the media, especially in our globalized world.
The media has a huge influence on how we see other cultures, both positively and negatively. It can shape public opinion and even reinforce those harmful stereotypes we talked about.
The textbook discusses this idea called agenda-setting theory. Basically, the media tells us what to think about, even if it doesn't dictate our opinions.
It's like a spotlight. They shine it on certain issues and stories, and those become the ones we focus on. And of course, those choices are often influenced by the media's own cultural lens.
Which ties back to what we were saying about stereotypes. The way the media portrays different cultures can really influence public perception, sometimes in damaging ways.
Definitely. It's a reminder to be critical consumers of media and to seek out diverse perspectives. We can't just rely on those mediated images to understand the complexities of other cultures.
Okay, so we've unpacked a lot of the theoretical stuff, but what does it all mean for us as individuals trying to navigate this global village?
Well, it means recognizing that culture isn't like a museum exhibit. It's a living, breathing thing that's always changing and adapting.
Yeah, the textbook talks about how cultures can influence each other, like the spread of K-pop and yoga around the world. They call that cultural diffusion, right?
Right. And it's so interesting to see how those cultural exchanges happen. Sometimes it leads to these really cool blends and adaptations. Think about how yoga's been adopted and modified in different cultures to fit their own beliefs and practices.
So are cultures becoming more alike because of globalization? The sources mention this idea of cultural convergence.
It's true that the world's becoming more interconnected and some cultural boundaries are blurring, but it's not as simple as everyone becoming the same. The textbook uses that McDonald's in Russia example again. They had to adjust to local tastes and values, even though they're a global brand.
There's that globalization again, that balancing act between global and local forces. It's like a cultural dance.
And it's important to remember that not everyone has equal footing in this dance. The textbook also talks about cultural colonialism, where dominant cultures can end up, overwhelming less powerful ones.
So it's not just about understanding cultural differences, but also being aware of those power dynamics and advocating for, like, preserving cultural diversity.
Absolutely. It's about appreciating those differences while also being sensitive to the complexities of cultural exchange.
Okay, so let's get practical. The sources offer some tips for improving our own intercultural communication skills. Where do we even start?
I think the first step is cultivating what the textbook calls cultural relativism. Basically, understanding that different cultures have different ways of doing things, and none are inherently better or worse.
Like trying to see the world through their eyes, not judging it based on our own cultural yardstick.
Exactly. And remember those three perceptual tendencies we talked about: closure, familiarity, and expectation. Those are constantly shaping our interpretations, especially when we encounter something unfamiliar.
So we should actively question our assumptions when interacting with people from different cultures. Don't just jump to conclusions based on what's normal for us.
Right. And be extra mindful of those nonverbal cues. Remember, a thumbs up can have very different meanings depending on where you are in the world.
The textbook even suggested doing some homework before interacting with another culture. Even a little research can go a long way.
And don't be afraid to ask questions. It shows you're genuinely interested in understanding their perspective, and most people really appreciate that.
It's like saying, hey, I know our cultures are different, and I want to learn more about yours.
Exactly. And remember, communication's a two-way street. It's not just about understanding the other person. It's also about making sure we're communicating clearly and respectfully.
So being aware of our own communication style and how it might come across to someone from a different background.
For example, the textbook explains the difference between high context and low context cultures.
Right, like in high context cultures, a lot of the meaning is unspoken, relying on shared understanding and nonverbal cues. In low context cultures, things are spelled out more directly.
So someone from a high context culture might find a very direct communication style, rude, while someone from a low context culture might find a more indirect style confusing.
So even if you're speaking the same language, those cultural differences in communication styles can still lead to misunderstandings.
Absolutely. It's about being sensitive to those nuances and adapting our approach accordingly. But at the heart of it all, I think it comes back to empathy. That ability to step into someone else's shoes, to see the world from their perspective, even if it's very different from our own.
And even when we make mistakes, which we all do, it's about owning up to them, learning from them, and trying to do better next time.
It's a journey, not a destination. The more we engage with different cultures, the more we realize how much we have to learn.
Okay, so the sources also talk about some specific challenges that come up in intercultural communication. Language is an obvious one.
Yeah, even when people technically speak the same language, differences in, like dialects, accents, slang, can all lead to confusion.
Not to mention when you have to rely on translation or interpretation, the textbook says that can add a whole other layer of complexity.
It's more than just swapping words. You have to find a way to convey the meaning and the cultural nuances accurately.
The sources also go into the emotional side of intercultural communication.
Yeah, navigating different cultural norms around emotions can be tricky. What's considered appropriate to express and how you express it can vary widely.
Like some cultures are much more expressive than others.
And those differences can lead to misinterpretations. You might mistake someone's reserve for coldness or someone's enthusiasm for aggression if you're not aware of those cultural norms.
The textbook even said different cultures might have different rules about what emotions are even okay to express in certain situations.
Exactly. What might be perfectly fine to express, say, in a social setting, might be considered totally inappropriate in a professional context, depending on the culture.
So adapting to those unspoken emotional rules is another piece of the puzzle. And speaking of adapting, the sources talk about culture shock, that feeling of disorientation you can get when you're immersed in a new culture.
It's like being dropped into a different world where all the rules are different. It can feel overwhelming, even isolating.
The textbook mentions some common symptoms: feeling homesick, irritable, even withdrawn.
It's important to remember those are normal reactions. It doesn't mean you're failing to adapt. It's just your brain trying to make sense of all this new information and experience.
The textbook really emphasized seeking support during that adjustment period, whether it's from other immigrants, cultural mentors, even mental health professionals.
Having a support system can make a huge difference in navigating those challenges and feeling less alone.
But even when you do adapt, it doesn't necessarily mean giving up your own cultural identity, right?
Exactly. It's about finding a balance between maintaining your own sense of self while also participating in the new culture. And that balance looks different for everyone.
Right. Some people might choose to fully embrace the new culture, while others might feel more comfortable holding on to their original culture more tightly.
The key is to find what works best for you, while also respecting the norms and values of the new culture. It's a personal journey.
That brings us to another interesting point the sources make: that link between communication and identity.
Yeah, the way we communicate is such a big part of who we are. It shapes how we see ourselves and how others see us. And that can get really complex in intercultural contexts.
The textbook talks about the challenges of juggling multiple cultural identities, especially for people from minority groups or those who've lived in many different cultures.
Right. They might code switch, adapting their language and behavior depending on the situation, who they're talking to.
So it's like having different communication modes depending on the cultural context.
Exactly. It's a way of navigating those different worlds, expressing different facets of their identity. But it can also be stressful, especially if they feel pressure to conform to certain expectations.
It seems like the message from the sources is to embrace those multiple identities, find ways to express them authentically.
It's about celebrating the richness of those diverse experiences and challenging the stereotypes that try to box people in.
So how do we build bridges across those cultural differences? The sources talk a lot about the importance of relationships.
Despite all our differences, we all share those same basic human needs and desires, right? That's a foundation we can build on.
The textbook highlights the role of self-disclosure, sharing personal information as a way to build trust and intimacy.
But remember, what's considered appropriate to share varies across cultures. So it's about being sensitive to those cultural boundaries, respecting different comfort levels.
It seems like listening is key, especially in these intercultural interactions. The sources talk a lot about empathy and active listening.
It's not just about hearing the words, but trying to understand the meaning behind them. Put aside your own assumptions and truly try to see things from their perspective.
And be willing to share your own experiences and perspectives too, to create that space for genuine dialogue.
Exactly. It's about building that bridge of understanding. And that starts with those small acts of communication.
The sources offer some tips for, improving those listening skills in cross-cultural situations.
Pay attention to both verbal and nonverbal cues. Remember, so much communication happens beyond the words themselves.
Don't interrupt or finish their sentences, even if you think you know what they're going to say.
Give them the space to express themselves fully. And when there are language barriers, be patient. Use clear language. Don't be afraid to use gestures or visual aids.
Then maybe summarize or paraphrase what you've heard to make sure you're both on the same page.
Those small efforts can make a huge difference in building trust and rapport across those cultural divides.
Now, one thing I'm curious about is using humor in cross-cultural situations. The sources touch on that, and it seems like it could be tricky.
Humor is so deeply tied to cultural context. What's funny in one culture could be totally offensive or confusing in another.
The textbook warned against using humor that relies on stereotypes or makes fun of another culture.
Right. It's about using humor thoughtfully and respectfully. If you're not sure if something's appropriate, it's better to err on the side of caution.
Better to miss a joke than accidentally offend someone.
Exactly. And that brings us to another important point. Communicating in a non-judgmental way.
So, recognizing that different cultures have different values and beliefs, and none are inherently right or wrong.
Right. It's about approaching those differences with curiosity and respect, not judgment or condemnation.
It's also about challenging our own biases, realizing that our way of seeing the world isn't the only valid one.
The sources suggest using I statements, focusing on your own experiences and feelings, rather than making generalizations about the other person or their culture.
And avoiding language that sounds accusatory or blaming.
It's about creating a safe space for dialogue where everyone feels heard and respected.
Okay, so we can't talk about communication today without talking about technology. It's completely changed how we interact with the world, including across cultures.
It's amazing to think that we can connect with people from all over the world instantly now, sharing ideas and experiences in real time.
Social media and other digital platforms have opened up incredible opportunities for, like, intercultural exchange.
But the sources also point out some potential downsides. One is the risk of misinterpretations, since you don't have those nonverbal cues to rely on in text-based communication.
The textbook recommended using emojis or other visual cues to help convey your tone.
It's also important to be aware of cultural differences in online communication styles. Some cultures might be more formal or indirect, while others are more casual and direct.
And respecting those differences, adapting our style accordingly.
The sources also talk about the importance of digital literacy when it comes to intercultural communication online.
Like being able to critically evaluate information, recognize biases, and avoid spreading misinformation.
And using technology responsibly and ethically to engage in online interactions that promote understanding and respect across cultures.
So it sounds like technology is a powerful tool for intercultural connection, but it also comes with its own set of challenges.
It's a double-edged sword. We have to be mindful of both its potential and its pitfalls.
Okay, so the sources also explore how intercultural communication plays out in different areas of society, like business, politics, education, even healthcare.
In the business world, those skills are becoming more and more essential. As companies expand globally and workforces become more diverse, understanding those cultural differences can make or break a deal.
The textbook talked about the importance of understanding different cultural approaches to, like, negotiation, decision-making, even just basic communication protocols.
For example, some cultures might value a more collaborative approach to negotiation, while others might be more comfortable with a more competitive style.
Knowing those differences can be key to building successful business relationships across cultures.
The sources also highlight the role of intercultural communication in diplomacy and conflict resolution. In a world that's increasingly interconnected, understanding and respecting different perspectives is crucial for building peaceful and productive relationships between nations.
And the textbook discussed some of the strategies that, like, diplomats and intercultural mediators use to facilitate communication and bridge those divides.
Often those strategies involve active listening, empathy, and a willingness to find common ground, even when there are really deep disagreements.
It sounds like it takes a lot of skill and sensitivity to navigate those complex cultural and political landscapes.
Absolutely. It's a delicate dance. And those skills are also becoming more important in education.
Right. As classrooms become more diverse, teachers need to be able to connect with students from all sorts of backgrounds.
The textbook talks about creating culturally inclusive learning environments where everyone feels safe and respected, and where those unique perspectives are valued.
And it sounds like teachers need to be aware of their own cultural biases and how those might be influencing their interactions with students.
It's about adapting your teaching style to meet the needs of diverse learners, recognizing that one size doesn't fit all.
And then there's healthcare, where clear communication can be absolutely critical.
As patient populations become more diverse, healthcare providers need to be able to communicate effectively with people from all sorts of backgrounds. That means being sensitive to different cultural beliefs about, health and illness, communication styles, even decision-making processes.
The textbook emphasized cultural sensitivity and humility in providing patient-centered care.
And it stressed the importance of addressing language barriers by using qualified interpreters when necessary.
It seems like those communication skills can really make a difference in patient outcomes, satisfaction, and even reducing healthcare disparities.
Absolutely. It's about ensuring that everyone has access to quality care, regardless of their cultural background.
So it's clear that intercultural communication isn't just an academic subject. It's woven into every aspect of our lives. So much to think about. We've really explored how cultures shape how we see things and how tricky it can be to communicate across those differences. But for someone listening who wants to actually get better at this whole intercultural communication thing, what are some key takeaways? Like, what can they put into practice?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway, and it really comes up again and again in all these sources, is approaching intercultural communication with humility. It's recognizing that you don't have all the answers and there's always more to learn.
So ditch the ego, embrace the learning process.
Exactly. Be open to different perspectives, even if they, challenge your assumptions or make you feel a bit uncomfortable.
The sources really highlighted the importance of listening, especially when you're interacting with people from different cultural backgrounds.
Absolutely. Active listening is so important. It goes beyond just hearing the words, is trying to understand the meaning behind them, the cultural context, the emotions, the unspoken messages.
So putting aside our own filters and biases, really stepping into their shoes.
Exactly. And don't hesitate to ask clarifying questions, especially if there are language barriers or if communication styles are different. It shows you're genuinely trying to understand.
Speaking of understanding, the sources also talk about being aware of our own nonverbal communication.
It's true. It's so easy to forget that our body language, tone of voice, even facial expressions all send messages, often without us realizing it. And those messages can be interpreted so differently across cultures.
So we need to be mindful of how we come across, maybe adjust our nonverbal communication depending on who we're talking to.
For example, direct eye contact is a sign of respect in some cultures, but can be seen as aggressive in others. Knowing those nuances can prevent a lot of misunderstandings.
It's like all those travel guides that warn you about hand gestures that are okay in one country but offensive in another.
Exactly. A little research can go a long way.
Beyond those individual skills, the sources also talk about building relationships across cultures.
At the end of the day, we're all human. We share those basic needs and desires. Finding that common ground, building genuine connections with people from different cultures can really enrich your life.
Stepping outside our comfort zones, embracing that richness of human diversity.
Exactly. Building those relationships might take time and effort, especially with those cultural differences in how we communicate.
So be patient, be respectful, be open to learning from each other.
The rewards are definitely worth it. Those cross-cultural friendships, those collaborations, they can open your mind to new ways of thinking, broaden your horizons, help you grow.
So after this deep dive into intercultural communication, what's one key message you hope our listeners will take away and use in their own lives?
For me, it's embracing the beauty and the complexity of our world. Recognizing that those cultural differences, those diverse ways of seeing and interacting with the world are what make life so rich and fascinating.
Approaching those differences not with fear, not with judgment, but with curiosity, empathy, and a real desire to connect.
Exactly. Remembering that we're all part of this global village and being able to communicate across cultures is essential. It's how we create a more peaceful, understanding, and just world for everyone.
So well said. To our listeners, as you keep exploring this global village, remember to keep learning, keep listening, and keep connecting. You might just discover a whole new world out there. See you next time on the Facilitators Deep Dive Podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery. Until next time.
See you then.